What happens when the first woman says no to marriage and yes to eternity? Good evening, sleepy soul. Welcome back to another quiet story from the Sleepless Nun. Tonight, we witness the birth of something that would change the world forever. The moment when women first discovered they could choose God over husbands, heaven over hearth, eternity over everyday love. Dim your lights now. Let the darkness settle around you like the rough wool of a desert hermit's cloak. Feel how it scratches slightly, then softens, then becomes a second skin. Close your eyes if they're ready, or let them rest, half-lidded, watching shadows dance on the wall like they did in the caves of the first holy women. Listen! Do you hear that? It's the sound of sand shifting in the Egyptian desert, the whisper of rough linen against stone, the careful breathing of a woman learning to be alone with the alone. These are the sounds that started it all, before bells and chants and organized prayer, before anyone knew what holiness looked like with a woman's face. Tonight, we travel to the years 270 to 400 AD, when Christianity was still wet clay, still finding its shape, still deciding what devotion looked like. The age of martyrs was ending. The age of monks was beginning. But between the blood and the rules, something else was happening. Women were discovering a new kind of martyrdom. The slow death of the self in the desert sun. The daily crucifixion of desire on the altar of divine love. Before anyone knew what to call a woman who refused to marry anyone but Christ, these were the years of beautiful chaos when holiness was an experiment, and every woman who chose it was writing the rules with her life. We'll walk with the pioneers, the desert mothers who fled to Egyptian sands, leaving footprints that would become highways. The Roman virgins who turned their fathers' villas into holy houses, transforming wealth into worship. The Syrian stylites who lived between earth and heaven, teaching us that sometimes the only way forward is up. These were the women who invented female monasticism. Not the men, though history remembers their names louder, writes their rules larger. But the women who first understood that virginity could be power, that refusal could be rebellion, that saying no to the world meant saying yes to something vast and terrible and beautiful. They had no blueprints, no rule of Benedict to follow, no centuries of tradition to lean on. Just the wild certainty that there must be another way to be a woman in the world. A way that didn't involve bearing children for men who saw you as property. A way that didn't require disappearing into another family's name. A way that let you keep your own soul. Watch how they fumble toward holiness. How they make mistakes that become miracles. How they flee their families only to create new ones. How they trade earthly marriage for heavenly union, and discover that God, too, can be a difficult husband. Some went to the desert alone, becoming living ghosts in caves that still echo with their prayers. Others gathered in groups, learning that community has its own asceticisms, that living with other women who've chosen God can be harder than living with scorpions. Some stayed in cities, navigating the dangerous waters of being holy and visible, virgin and powerful, refusing the world while still walking through it. If this journey brings you stillness, if these first sacred voices help you drift into the sweetest sleep, tap subscribe when you're ready. Your presence helps their forgotten stories find new dreamers. But for now, Just breathe. Just listen. Just let yourself sink into their world, like sinking into warm sand. We begin in Alexandria, that jewel of Egypt where Greek philosophy and Christian mysticism dance together in the streets, where a young woman named Syncletica is about to trade silk for sackcloth, beauty for beatitude, and change the meaning of marriage forever. In the merchant quarter of Alexandria, where gold changes hands like prayers, a daughter is about to become a scandal. Her name was Syncletica, and she was everything a merchant's daughter should be. Beautiful enough to double her father's business connections. Educated enough to manage household accounts. Young enough to bear many sons for whatever ambitious trader won the bidding war for her hand. In the great marriage market of Alexandria, she was premium goods wrapped in silk and scented with myrrh, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. But something was wrong with the merchandise, something her parents couldn't quite name, but felt in their bones every time they looked at their daughter. She smiled when she should, laughed at the right moments, poured wine for her father's guests with steady hands. But behind her eyes lived a distance that no amount of silk could bridge, as if she were already gone, already elsewhere, already belonging to something they couldn't see or understand. The first sign of trouble came when she was 12. A fever swept through Alexandria that summer, the kind that turns strong men into whimpering children, and children into memory. Syncletica caught it, burned for 7 days, and on the 8th day, when the fever broke, she spoke her first prophecy. "I saw myself," she whispered to her mother, who was spooning broth between her cracked lips. "But I was old, so old, living in a cave by the river. And I was happy." Her mother dropped the spoon. In those days, in that place, women didn't grow old in caves. They grew old in houses, surrounded by grandchildren. Or they didn't grow old at all. But Syncletica spoke with such certainty, such strange joy, that her mother crossed herself and never mentioned the fever dream to anyone. Some things were better buried in silence. The second sign came at 15, when the marriage proposals began arriving like ships to harbor. The son of a Roman glass merchant, a Syrian trader with roots to India, an Egyptian official with bloodlines stretching back to the Ptolemies, each offer more glittering than the last, each one sliding off Syncletica like water off oiled skin. "I'm not ready," she told her father after the 5th refusal. "You're never ready," he replied, but gently. He loved his strange daughter, even if he didn't understand her. Marriage isn't about readiness, it's about timing, and your time is now. But Syncletica had been reading, not just the household texts appropriate for women, though she knew those too, but the strange new Christian writings that circulated through Alexandria's underground like precious contraband. Stories of virgin martyrs who chose lions over marriage beds. Desert fathers who fled to the wilderness and found God waiting in the silence. And most fascinating of all, whispered tales of women who were doing the same. Women who simply left. She began to prepare in secret, learning Coptic from the household slaves, memorizing the Psalms in the dark hours before dawn, practicing stillness, sitting motionless for hours, until her body became a question mark, and the answer was always the same. Not this, not here, not the life you've planned for me. Her penance, meanwhile, planned a wedding. They'd chosen the glass merchant's son, Roman connections would protect the family business as the empire shifted and shuddered. The contracts were drawn, the dowry assembled, the wedding dress commissioned from the finest weavers in the Greek quarter. Everyone agreed it would be a splendid match. Everyone except the bride, who spent her nights praying to a god her parents only half believed in, asking for what no woman had the right to ask: freedom, solitude, a life that belonged to no man. And then, as if God had a sense of dramatic timing, the plague came. Not the summer fever this time, but the real thing. The kind that emptied whole neighborhoods and turned Alexandria's famous streets into corridors of grief. It took her father first, drowning him in his own lungs despite all the physicians gold could buy. Then her mother, who simply stopped eating after the funeral and faded like a manuscript left in sunlight. Within 3 months, Syncletica was an orphan. Within 4, she was wealthy beyond measure. Within 5, she was gone. The morning of her departure, she stood in her father's counting room, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of a successful merchant's life. Bolts of silk from China, amphorae of wine from Cyprus, precious oils in alabaster jars, gold coins stamped with the faces of emperors living and dead. All of it hers now. All of it meaningless as dust. She called in the household slaves first. "You're free," she told them, handing each their manumission papers and a purse heavy with gold. Some wept. Some stood frozen, freedom too large a gift to grasp immediately. One old woman, who'd raised Syncletica from birth, grabbed her hands. "Where will you go, little bird?" "To find the cave I saw in my fever dream," Syncletica replied. "To grow old the way women aren't supposed to grow old." Next came the relatives, circling like vultures dressed in mourning clothes. To them she gave everything: the house, the business, the contracts and connections. They could barely contain their joy behind their masks of concern. Let them have it. Let them choke on it. She kept only 3 things: a rough cloak she bought from a pilgrim, a copy of the Psalms in Coptic, and a kitchen knife. The knife was for her hair. In the pre-dawn darkness, alone in what had been her childhood room, she gathered her famous dark hair. Hair that poets had compared to night rivers, to black silk, to all the tired metaphors men use when they want to own beauty, and began to cut. The blade was dull. It pulled and tore more than cut. Good. Let it hurt. Let the transformation cost something. She cut until her scalp showed through in patches, until she looked diseased or mad or holy. All the same thing, really, to anyone watching a woman destroy her own beauty. The hair fell around her feet like a sacrifice, like a small, dark death. When she was finished, she didn't recognize the face in the bronze mirror. Perfect. Now she could begin. The desert called from beyond Alexandria's walls. Not the deep desert where the famous fathers lived. She wasn't ready for that yet. But the near desert, the margin lands where the city gave up its claim and wildness began. She walked out through the gate of the sun just as dawn was breaking, another beggar among beggars, another mad woman among the mad. No one looked twice at a shorn woman in rough cloth. Alexandria had seen stranger things. She found her cave by the old river, just as the fever vision had promised. Not much of a cave, really. More of a hollow in the rock face, barely deep enough to shelter from sun and wind. But it was empty, and it was hidden. and it was hers. She crawled inside and sat in the darkness, feeling the weight of her choice settle around her like a second skin. What had she done? Given away a fortune for a hole in the rock. Traded comfort for uncertainty. Chosen God over everything the world said mattered. The enormity of it should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something she'd never felt in her father's house. Dressed in silk and surrounded by luxury. She felt free. She felt real. She felt like herself for the first time in her life. But freedom, she would learn, was just the beginning. The desert had lessons to teach, and they all hurt. First came the physical trials. Hunger that gnawed like a living thing. Thirst that turned her tongue to leather. Cold that reached into her bones and shook them like dice. She learned to find water in hidden springs, to know which desert plants could sustain life and which brought death. She learned that the body could survive on much less than Alexandria had taught her to need. Then came the mental trials. Alone with her thoughts for the first time, she discovered how loud the mind could scream. Memories rose like phantoms. Her mother's disappointed face, her father's gentle confusion, the life she could have lived parading through her cave in wedding clothes. Doubt came to visit, dressed in the voices of everyone who'd ever told her women weren't meant for this. What was she doing? What was she proving? Who would even know if she gave up? Crawled back to the city, claimed temporary madness, and accepted the first marriage proposal that came. But she didn't go back. Something held her in that cave. Call it stubbornness. Call it God. Call it the fierce joy of finally living a life that fit her soul. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The city girl learned the desert's rhythms. The merchant's daughter became merchant of a different commerce, trading comfort for clarity, silk for silence. Word began to spread, as word always does. The mad girl living in the cave, the virgin who'd thrown away a fortune, the new type of martyr who died not all at once in the arena, but day by day in the wilderness. Other women came, tentatively at first. Young girls fleeing unwanted marriages, widows tired of being remarried like property. Slaves who bought their freedom but didn't know what to do with it. Teach us, they said. I know nothing, Syncletica replied. But that was a lie. She knew the most important thing. That a woman could choose, could walk away, could say no to the world and yes to the vast silence where God waited. Could trade everything for nothing and discover that nothing sometimes was everything. She taught them what the desert had taught her. How to fast without dying. How to pray without words. How to be alone without loneliness. How to find God in the absence of everything else. Some stayed, some left, some came back. Slowly, without meaning to, she became what Alexandria had never allowed her to be. A teacher, a leader, a mother of souls instead of bodies. Years passed. Her fame spread. The mad girl became the holy woman. The scandal became the saint. Bishops came to consult her. Philosophers came to debate her. Rich women came to give her gold she didn't want. Through it all, she stayed in her cave by the river, growing old exactly as her fever vision had promised. Growing old the way women weren't supposed to, without husband or children, without the proofs of female success. Just her and God, and the steady stream of seekers who needed to know that another life was possible. How do you bear the loneliness? A young woman asked her once. Syncletica laughed, a sound like wind through dry grass. Loneliness? Child, I spent my first 20 years surrounded by people and was lonelier than I've ever been in this cave. Loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about being in the wrong life. Find the right life, even if it's a cave in the desert, and you'll never be lonely again. She lived to be 84, they say, died peacefully in her cave, surrounded by the spiritual daughters she'd never planned to have. Her last words were practical to the end. Remember, it's easier to build a ship in harbor than in a storm. Begin your spiritual life while you have strength. Don't wait for the perfect moment. The desert is patient, but life is not. They buried her in the sand outside her cave, marking the spot with a simple stone. Within a generation, a monastery rose around that stone. Within a century, her sayings were being copied and passed through the Christian world like the precious contraband they were. The merchant's daughter who said no had become merchandise of a different kind. Wisdom traded freely, example that couldn't be contained, proof that women could choose the radical path and survive it. But that's the end of her story, and we're still at the beginning. Watch her now, in those first days in the cave, learning to be alone. See how she sits in the darkness, feeling the weight of her freedom, the terror of her choice, the wild joy of finally living as herself. This is how it begins, not with rules or structures or sanctioned holiness, but with a woman alone in a cave, discovering that she is enough, that God is enough. That the life everyone said was impossible is not only possible, but necessary. The desert watches, the river whispers, and Syncletica begins the slow work of becoming herself, one difficult day at a time. The cave holds its silence as night deepens, while across the empire, in Cappadocia's green valleys, another kind of revolution quietly begins. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, sealed with the wax of the provincial governor, heavy with the kind of news that changes lives. Matrona broke the seal with steady hands, though she already knew what it would say. In a world where young women had few surprises, death was the most predictable visitor of all. "Your betrothed has departed this life," the letter began, as if departure were a choice, as if her fiancé had simply decided to take a different road. Fever, it said. Quick and merciful. The funeral had already taken place. The marriage contracts were, naturally, void. Matrona set the letter down and looked out the window of her family's villa, where spring was exploding across the Cappadocian hills in shameless green. She was supposed to feel something, grief, perhaps, or relief. The man had been 30 years her senior, chosen by her father for his connections rather than any compatibility. Instead, she felt the strangest sensation, as if chains she hadn't known she was wearing had suddenly turned to smoke. Her mother found her there an hour later, still holding the letter, still staring at the hills, wearing an expression that would have frightened her if she'd seen it in a mirror. It was the face of a woman who just discovered she could fly. "We'll find you another match," her mother said gently, mistaking stillness for shock. "You're young, beautiful. The family name carries weight. This changes nothing." "It changes everything," Matrona replied, and her voice carried a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her 12 years should have reached. "I've been married and widowed without ever being a wife. God has made his intentions clear. I belong to him now." Her mother laughed, not cruelly, but with the wariness of a woman who'd heard religious fervor from children before. You'll feel differently when the grief passes. Every girl dreams of the convent when faced with an old husband. But you'll want children. They all do, eventually. But Matrona had been watching, studying, learning lessons her expensive tutors never meant to teach. She'd seen how marriage worked in their world. Her mother, pregnant 19 times, watching child after child die, until bearing life became synonymous with bearing grief. She'd seen her older sister traded to a man who beat her for sport, returning home with bruises hidden beneath expensive silk. She'd seen how women disappeared into their husbands' names, their husbands' homes, their husbands' desires, until nothing remained of the girls they'd been. And she'd been reading. Not just Homer and Plato, the texts appropriate for an educated woman, but the new Christian writings that spoke of a different way. Virgin martyrs who chose death over marriage. Desert mothers who chose sand over silk. Women who discovered that saying no to men meant saying yes to something larger. The story set fire to something in her chest, a burning that felt like truth. "I will never marry," she announced at dinner that night, her voice cutting through the comfortable chatter of a wealthy family at table. "I consider myself wed to Christ. The ceremony has already taken place. I am no longer available." Her father choked on his wine. Her brothers laughed, thinking it a joke. Her younger brother Gregory, who would one day become the Bishop of Nyssa, who would make her famous in his writings, watched her with those two intelligent eyes and said nothing. He alone seemed to understand that she meant every word. The battle began immediately. Her father, Basil the Elder, was a reasonable man, a lawyer who believed in persuasion over force. He brought scholars to debate her, priests to counsel her, matrons to share the joys of marriage and motherhood. Matrona dismantled their arguments with a logic that left them sputtering. She quoted scripture they'd forgotten, cited martyrs they'd never heard of, asked questions that had no comfortable answers. "If virginity is holy," she asked one flustered priest, "why do you counsel me against it? If marriage is the highest calling for women, why did Christ himself remain unwed? If bearing children is my purpose, what of the barren? Are they purposeless? Your theology has holes large enough to drive camels through." Her father tried bribery next. New clothes, which she gave to the servants. Jewelry, which she sold and distributed to the poor. Promises of travel, education. Freedoms unusual for a woman, all met with the same serene refusal. She had found her position and would not be moved. Her mother tried tears. "You're breaking my heart. Don't you want to give me grandchildren? Don't you want the joy I've known? The joy of losing 15 children to fever and accident?" Matrona replied, not cruelly, but with devastating accuracy. "The joy of watching your body become a battlefield where life and death wage war? Mother, I love you too much to lie. Your joy is painted over grief so deep it has no bottom. I choose a different canvas." But the real scandal wasn't her refusal to marry. Cappadocian society could absorb the occasional religious virgin, could make space for women who chose the convent over the marriage bed. The real scandal was what Matrona did next. She didn't flee to the desert, didn't seek out a remote convent, didn't remove herself from the world like a proper holy woman should. Instead, she stayed home and began, quietly at first, to transform her father's villa into something unprecedented, a domestic monastery, where the sacred and the mundane dance together in ways that made bishops nervous. It started small, rising before dawn for prayers, fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, treating the household slaves as equals, eating with them, working beside them, scandalizing visitors who expected to be served by invisible hands. She turned her portion of the villa into a space of deliberate simplicity. Rough blankets replacing silk, oil lamps instead of elaborate candelabra, meals of bread and vegetables, while the rest of the family dined on delicacies. "You're making us look like fools," her father raged. "The whole province is talking. The daughter of Basil the Elder, dressed like a servant, behaving like a madwoman. You'll ruin your brothers' careers. No one will marry your sisters." "Good," Matrona replied. "Perhaps they'll be free to choose their own lives." When her father died, a frustration, some said, though the official cause was a weakness of the heart, everyone expected Matrona to finally conform. A household needs a man to run it. Unmarried daughters need husbands. The natural order must be maintained. Instead, Matrona did something that sent shockwaves through Cappadocian society. She convinced her mother to join her in her strange experiment. Together, they transformed the family estate into something that had never existed before, a community of women living by religious rule without male oversight. Not a convent in the desert, not a collection of hermits, but something new, a household that was also a monastery, a family that was also a spiritual community, a space where noble women and slaves prayed as equals. The rules evolved organically. Prayer 7 times daily, anchoring the day in sacred rhythm. Manual labor for all. No one too noble to grind grain or tend gardens. Communal meals where scripture was read and discussed. An infirmary for the sick, regardless of their ability to pay. An orphanage for abandoned children. A school where girls learn to read, not just scripture, but philosophy, mathematics, the subjects usually reserved for boys. Women began arriving at their gates, some fleeing bad marriages, some seeking education, some simply curious about this new way of being female in the world. Matrona accepted them all, creating a structured but flexible life that honored both the need for solitude and the power of community. "You're creating chaos," the local bishop complained, arriving unannounced to investigate reports of irregularities. "Women need guidance, structure, male oversight. What you're doing here is unprecedented." Matrona served him bread she'd baked herself, water from their well, sitting with him as an equal rather than a subordinate. "Show me," she said calmly, "where Christ said women need male oversight. Show me where he established different rules for female disciples. I'll wait." The bishop sputtered about tradition, about order, about the dangers of innovation, but he couldn't answer her fundamental question. If women could be martyrs for the faith, why couldn't they be leaders in it? If they could die for Christ, why couldn't they live for him on their own terms? Her brothers watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Basil, who would become the great Cappadocian father, visited often, engaging his sister in theological debates that sharpened his own thinking. He would later admit that many of his famous ideas about communal monasticism came from watching Matrona's experiment. Gregory loved her fiercely, but feared for her, writing letters begging her to be more careful, more conventional, less visible. You're drawing too much attention, he warned. The empire is changing. Christianity is becoming respectable. They won't tolerate irregularities much longer. Then let them come, Matrona replied. I've built something real here, something necessary. If the empire finds that threatening, perhaps the empire needs to examine its own soul. The community grew. 20 women became 50. 50 became 100. The villa expanded, adding dormitories, workshops, a larger chapel. What had begun as one woman's refusal to marry had become a movement. Proof that female monasticism could exist within the world rather than apart from it. That holiness didn't require fleeing to the desert. Matrona instituted practices that would later become standard in monasteries everywhere. The divine office, prayers at set times throughout the day, lectio divina, sacred reading that moved beyond mere literacy into meditation, manual labor as spiritual practice, communal ownership of property, care for the poor as worship. All innovations that seemed radical when performed by women without male supervision. You've created a city of God, Basil told her during one visit, watching the women move through their ordered day with a grace that made his own monastery seem clumsy by comparison. But it's a city that challenges everything we think we know about how God's kingdom should be ordered. Good, Matrona replied. God's kingdom was never meant to mirror Rome's. If it makes men uncomfortable to see women living in spiritual authority, perhaps the discomfort is the point. Perhaps that's exactly what needs challenging. The scandal deepened when Matrona began teaching. Not just the women in her community, but anyone who would listen. Her biblical commentaries drew crowds. Her interpretations of Scripture challenged established readings. She spoke of Miriam as Moses' equal, of Deborah as proof that women could lead nations, of Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles. Dangerous ideas, beautifully expressed. You go too far, even her mother warned, though she'd become Matrona's most devoted follower. Teaching men? Interpreting Scripture publicly? There are limits, daughter, even for us. The only limits, Matrona replied, are the ones we accept. I've spent my life watching brilliant women pour their intelligence into managing households and raising children. Good work, necessary work, but not the only work we're capable of. If God gave me a mind, didn't He mean for me to use it? If He gave me a voice, didn't He mean for me to speak? She spoke. Oh, how she spoke! About the equality of souls before God. About virginity not as negation, but as freedom. About community as a form of prayer. About work as worship. About the possibility of women creating their own sacred spaces, their own rules, their own relationships with the divine. Every word a small revolution, every idea a crack in the wall of what was considered possible. When Gregory finally convinced her to let him write down some of her teachings, she agreed on one condition, that he record not just her words, but the words of all the women in the community, their insights, their struggles, their small revelations. The resulting work would influence monasticism for centuries, though few would know that many of the ideas attributed to the great Cappadocian fathers actually came from the sister who refused to be silent. Matrona lived to see her community become a model copied across the empire. Women wrote from Gaul, from Egypt, from Syria, asking for her rule, her guidance, her blessing on their own experiments in communal life. She sent them all the same message. There is no single rule. Each community must find its own way. The only constants are prayer, work, and the radical belief that women can organize their own spiritual lives. She died as she had lived, surrounded by women she'd taught to be free. Her last words were typically practical. Don't mourn. Celebrate. We've proven it can be done. Now go do it better. They buried her in the chapel she'd built, marking her grave with a simple stone that read, Matrona, Teacher. No mention of her noble birth, her famous brothers, her revolutionary life. Just the two words that mattered most. She had been a teacher, and her lesson was simple. Women could choose, could lead, could create their own sacred spaces, could say no to the world's plans and build something better. The bishop who had once complained about chaos preached at her funeral. She was difficult, he admitted to the packed chapel. She challenged everything we thought we knew. She made us uncomfortable. Thank God for that. Comfort never changed anything. Matrona did. Her brother Gregory would go on to write beautiful theological treatises about her life, turning her into a plaster saint, smoothing her rough edges, making her safe for posterity. But the women who had lived with her knew better, knew the steel beneath the silk, the revolution beneath the piety, the absolute refusal to be anything less than fully herself that had made everything else possible. They carried that knowledge out into the world, founding communities of their own, teaching their own students, creating a network of female monasticism that would survive the fall of empires. Each one a small scandal, each one proof that Matrona had been right. The world could be remade. It just took women willing to say no to what was and yes to what could be. The villa still stands, they say, transformed now into a proper monastery with proper rules and proper male oversight. But sometimes, in the hour before dawn, when the first prayers begin, you can still feel her presence. The girl who refused to disappear into marriage. The woman who created a new way of being in the world. The teacher whose greatest lesson was that women could write their own rules, create their own communities, find their own way to God. And in convents and communities across the world, women still do. Still rise before dawn to pray. Still work with their hands, still study and teach and lead, still choose the radical path of self-determination. All of them, whether they know it or not, daughters of Matrona, inheritors of the scandal she created, living proof that some rebellions begin not with swords, but with a simple refusal to be what the world expects. The bishop was right. Comfort never changed anything, but Matrona did. The scandal echoes through the empire's halls, while in Rome, a widow paces her villa at midnight, planning an escape that will shake the eternal city to its ancient foundations. The ship waited in Ostia's harbor like a promise, its sails furled, its hull dark against darker water. Paula stood at her villa's window, counting the hours until midnight, until freedom, until the life she'd been planning in secret for 3 years could finally begin. Below her, Rome slept its uneasy sleep, dreaming of past glories and present decline. The city that had conquered the world was learning what it meant to be conquered in return. Not by armies, but by time, by corruption, by the slow rot that comes when purpose dies. Paula knew the feeling intimately. She'd been dying the same slow death for 20 years, suffocating in silk, drowning in respectability, watching her soul shrivel while her body went through the motions of a proper Roman matron's life. Married at 14 to Toxotius, a senator whose bloodline stretched back to Aeneas. 5 children in 8 years, each birth tearing her body a little more. Each child another chain binding her to a life that fit like a shroud. She'd done everything right. Managed the household, hosted the dinners, worn the jewelry, smiled at the jokes, pretended not to notice when her husband came to bed smelling of other women's perfume. And for what? Toxotius died when she was 32, leaving her with wealth, status, and a howling emptiness that no amount of proper behavior could fill. Everyone expected her to remarry. A woman like Paula, still beautiful, still fertile, still wealthy, was too valuable to waste on widowhood. The offers came immediately, like vultures dressed in togas, each suitor calculating how her fortune could enhance his own. She refused them all, politely at first, then with increasing firmness, then with a cold fury that made her famous throughout Rome's aristocratic circles. Paula the Ice Widow, they called her. Paula the Untouchable, as if her refusal to be sold again was a character flaw rather than a sign of sanity. But something else had entered Paula's life during those first years of widowhood. Something that set fire to the ice everyone saw. His name was Jerome, and he was everything Roman society despised. A Christian fanatic, a scholar who preferred Hebrew to proper Latin, a man who spoke of desert mothers and virgin martyrs as if they were more admirable than senators' wives. Paula met him at a gathering she'd attended out of boredom. He was lecturing on his new translation of Scripture, turning familiar passages into unfamiliar challenges. Where the old Latin text spoke of resignation, Jerome's translations sang of rebellion. Where tradition counseled obedience, his words whispered of freedom. Paula sat in the back, her widow's veil hiding her face, and felt something inside her wake up for the first time in years. She began attending his lectures regularly, then seeking private instruction. Jerome was a difficult teacher, impatient, demanding, intolerant of the shallow piety that passed for faith in Roman circles. But Paula had spent 20 years being underestimated. Her mind, starved for real engagement, devoured the challenges he threw at her. Hebrew grammar, Greek philosophy, the writings of the Desert Fathers, the letters of the martyrs. "Why do you come here?" Jerome asked her once, after a particularly intense session on Origen's commentaries. "You could be remarried by now, safe, comfortable. Why choose this difficult path?" "Because comfort is killing me," Paula replied with an honesty that surprised them both. "Because I've been safe my whole life, and it feels like being buried alive. Because I want to do something with my mind besides calculating household accounts, and my soul besides pretending to be satisfied." It was Jerome who first told her about the monasteries rising in the East. Communities of women living by their own rules, studying scripture, copying texts, creating alternatives to the marriage or death options that trapped Roman women. He spoke of his time in the Syrian desert, of the female hermits who lived in caves and surpassed their male counterparts in ascetic devotion, of the double monasteries in Egypt, where men and women lived in parallel communities, separated but equal in their pursuit of God. "Could such a thing exist here, in Rome?" Paula asked. Jerome laughed, a bitter sound. "Rome tolerates Christianity now, but only a tame version. Domesticated, defanged. What you're imagining Women living independently, studying theology, creating their own communities. Rome would see it as a threat to the natural order. Then perhaps I shouldn't do it in Rome, Paula said quietly. The idea grew slowly at first, a fantasy to sustain her through the endless round of social obligations. But fantasies have a way of becoming plans when fed with enough desperate hope. Paula began her preparations carefully, learning Greek properly, not just the decorative phrases Roman ladies sprinkled in their conversation, studying the geography of the Holy Land, corresponding secretly with monasteries in Egypt and Syria, asking about their rules, their practices, their openness to Roman refugees. The real catalyst came when her daughter Blasilla died. 20 years old, beautiful, recently widowed herself, just beginning to join Paula in her studies. The fever took her in 3 days, leaving Paula holding a corpse that looked too much like herself at that age. Another bright mind sacrificed to Rome's hunger for breeding stock. Another woman who would never get the chance to be more than her body's functions. At the funeral, Paula made her decision. She would leave, take her remaining children, at least the ones willing to come, and build something new in the East. A monastery where women could study, pray, live, and die as themselves, rather than as someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's property. The scandal began immediately when she started liquidating her assets. Property that had been in Toxotius's family for generations sold to Syrian merchants. Jewelry that should have adorned future daughters-in-law converted to gold coins. Slaves freed with such rapidity that the markets flooded with skilled workers, driving down prices and infuriating other aristocrats. "You're destroying your children's inheritance," her son Toxotius the Younger raged. He'd inherited his father's name and his father's belief that women existed to increase family wealth, not disperse it. "I'm giving them a different inheritance," Paula replied, signing another bill of sale. "The knowledge that life can be more than accumulation, that freedom matters more than fortune, that choosing your own path is worth any price." Her son threatened legal action. Roman law gave him some grounds. A widow disposing of family property without male oversight was irregular at best. But Paula had spent 3 years studying more than just scripture with Jerome. She'd learned law too, finding loopholes that let her convert immovable property into portable wealth. By the time her son realized what she was doing, most of the fortune had already been transformed into forms he couldn't touch. Still, she might have stayed. Rome was hard to leave, even when it was killing you, if not for Marcella's visit. Marcella, another wealthy widow who turned her palace into a gathering place for Christian women, arrived one evening with news that changed everything. "They're moving against us," she said without preamble. "The Senate, the old families, they see what we're building. Women meeting without male supervision, studying texts, discussing theology. And they're frightened. There will be accusations, trials. They'll call us heretics, witches, corrupters of Roman virtue." "Let them come," Paula said, with more bravery than she felt. "No," Marcella shook her head. "You don't understand. Jerome is already preparing to leave. They've made his position untenable, and once he's gone, we lose our protection. Better to leave on our own terms than be driven out." That night, Paula wrote 2 letters, one to the captain in Ostia, confirming passage on his ship, one to each of her children, explaining what she couldn't say to their faces. Then she packed only what mattered: her books, her writing materials, and the small wooden cross that had belonged to Blasilla. The household slept as she moved through it one last time. 20 years of her life in these rooms. 20 years of being the perfect wife, the perfect widow. The perfect example of Roman womanhood. She touched the walls, the furniture, the things that had defined her for so long. Then she let them go, all of them. Every single tie that bound her to this life she'd never chosen. Her daughter Eustochium waited in the atrium, 16 years old and blazing with the same hunger that consumed Paula. She'd been the only one to understand, the only one to choose the uncertain future over the comfortable present. Together they slipped out the servants' entrance, cloaked and veiled like thieves, which they were, in a way, stealing themselves back from a world that thought it owned them. The streets of Rome at midnight were dangerous for women alone, but Paula found she didn't care. After 20 years of safety that felt like suffocation, danger tasted like wine. They moved quickly through the sleeping city, past the forums where men decided women's fates, past the temples where gods as trapped as their worshippers demanded bloody sacrifice, past the walls that had contained the known world for so long that everyone had forgotten there was an outside. At Ostia, Jerome waited with a small group of fellow refugees. His face was grim in the torchlight. "You're certain, once we sail, there's no returning. Rome has a long memory for those who reject her." "Rome rejected me first," Paula replied. "The moment I was born female in a world that sees women as breeding stock or decorative objects. I'm simply returning the favor." They boarded as the moon set, moving through darkness onto a ship that smelled of tar and possibility. Paula stood at the rail as the sailors prepared to cast off, looking back at the coastline that contained everything she'd known. Somewhere in that darkness, her son was probably discovering her letter. Her friends were waking to find her gone. Rome was learning that even its most proper matrons could choose rebellion. The wind caught the sails as dawn broke, pulling them away from Italy and toward a future Paula couldn't fully imagine. She knew only that she would build a monastery in Bethlehem, near the cave where Christ was born. That she would create a place where women could study scripture in its original languages, could live in community without male oversight, could choose poverty and freedom over wealth and captivity. "Regrets?" Jerome asked, joining her at the rail as Rome disappeared into morning mist. "None," Paula said, and meant it. "I've spent 35 years living someone else's life. Even if I only get a few years of my own, it will be worth it." She would get more than a few years, 2 decades in Bethlehem, building a monastery that would outlive the empire she'd fled, teaching women to read Hebrew and Greek, corresponding with scholars as an equal, creating a rule that balanced study with prayer, work with contemplation, proving that women could lead communities, interpret scripture, live full lives without ever being wives or mothers in the traditional sense. But that morning, sailing away from everything safe and known, Paula knew none of that, knew only that she was free, that the midnight escape she'd planned for 3 years had actually worked, that somewhere ahead lay a life that would finally fit her soul. The ship pulled away from shore, carrying a woman who'd chosen exile over captivity, uncertainty over suffocation, the vast unknown over the small known. Behind her, Rome woke to find one of its greatest ladies gone, fled in the night like a criminal, or like a woman who'd finally realized that the real crime was staying. Paula never looked back. There was too much ahead to see. The ship disappears into dawn's embrace, while in Milan, in the shadows of her family's tomb, another woman prepares to marry death itself. The tomb breathed with the musty exhalations of the dead, a sweetness that clung to the back of the throat like overripe fruit. Marcelina stood among her ancestors' bones on Christmas Eve, waiting to marry Christ in the presence of those who'd never had a choice in their own marriages. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here, surrounded by generations of women who'd been traded like cattle between powerful families, she would finally break the chain. Candles flickered against the carved names on the walls. Aurelia Marcellina died in childbirth at 16. Claudia Marcellina survived 8 pregnancies only to die of exhaustion at 30. Julia Marcellina, whose husband's fists left marks the funeral preparations couldn't quite hide. A litany of women sacrificed to the great Roman machine of family honor and bloodline preservation. Tonight, their descendant would choose a different sacrifice. "Are you certain about this location?" Pope Liberius asked, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. He'd come from Rome specifically for this consecration, intrigued by the request to perform the ceremony in such an unusual setting. "We could use the basilica. It would be more traditional." "Tradition is what killed them," Marcellina replied, gesturing to the names carved in stone. Every one of these women followed tradition, married who they were told, bore children until their bodies broke, died proper Roman matrons. I want them to witness something different. I want their bones to know that the chain ends here. Her younger brother Ambrose shifted nervously in the shadows. Only 12 years old, he already showed the intelligence that would one day make him Bishop of Milan. But tonight, he was just a boy watching his sister do something incomprehensible. Their older sister Satyrus understood even less, standing stiff with disapproval, representing the family's official position that Marcellina had lost her mind. She hadn't lost it. She'd found it. Found it in the stories of virgin martyrs that circulated through Milan's Christian community like contraband hope. Agnes choosing death at 13 rather than marriage. Thecla escaping through a window to follow Paul's teaching. Lucy, whose eyes were gouged out for refusing to look at her betrothed with proper submission. Women who discovered that their bodies could be fortresses rather than open cities, that virginity could be power rather than lack. The decision had come slowly, growing like a secret plant in the garden of her heart. Her parents' death when she was young had freed her from immediate marriage pressure. Satyrus, as head of the family, was more interested in his career than in arranging matches for a sister who helped raise his younger brother. And Marcellina used that freedom to read, to think, to discover that the hunger in her chest wasn't for a husband, but for something larger. "Begin," she told the Pope, and her voice carried the authority of someone who'd already crossed the bridge in her mind. There was no going back now, only forward into this strange new territory where women could choose God over men and make that choice stick. The ceremony unfolded in the flickering candlelight, different from a wedding, yet eerily similar. The veil that would mark her as claimed, the ring that would bind her to an invisible spouse, the vows that would wall her off from the ordinary world. But where a bride would promise obedience to a human husband, Marcelina promised availability to the divine. Where a wife would vow fertility, she vowed emptiness. Where marriage meant merger, this meant maintaining herself intact, whole, unbreached. Do you, Marcelina, take Christ as your eternal bridegroom, forsaking all earthly attachments? I do. The words fell into the tune's silence like stones into deep water. She felt the ripples spreading out, disturbing things that had been settled for generations. Somewhere in the darkness, she imagined her female ancestors stirring, wondering at this girl who dared to choose her own binding. Do you promise to keep your body as a temple, your heart as an altar, your life as a living sacrifice? I do. But even as she spoke the traditional words, Marcelina was already reimagining what they meant. Temple, yes, but she would decide who could enter. Altar, certainly, but she would choose what burned there. Sacrifice, always, but on her own terms. She wasn't fleeing the world like the desert mothers. She would remain in Milan, in her brother's household, visible and present and absolutely untouchable. The Pope placed the veil on her head, and she felt the weight of centuries settling on her shoulders. But also something else, a lightness as if chains she hadn't known she was wearing had suddenly dissolved. She was 23 years old, and she would never be sold, never be bred, never disappear into a husband's name and desires. The veil that marked her as taken also marked her as free. It is done, Pope Liberius announced, and his voice carried a mixture of solemnity and confusion. He'd consecrated virgins before, but never one who smiled like she'd won a battle rather than lost one. Never one who stood straighter after taking vows of submission. Never one who looked more alive in a tomb than most brides looked at their weddings. The small gathering dispersed quickly. The tomb was no place for celebration. And besides, what was there to celebrate? A woman removing herself from the marriage market was a tragedy in Roman eyes, even Christian Roman eyes. Waste of good breeding stock, selfishness dressed as holiness. But Marcelina didn't care about their whispers. She had what she wanted, a life that was hers to shape. The real work began the next morning. How does a consecrated virgin live in the world without being of it? How does she maintain her vows while navigating family dinners, social obligations, the daily life of a Roman household? Marcelina became an inventor, creating a way of being that had no precedent. She woke before dawn for prayers, turning her small room into a chapel where she could meet God in the darkness. But then she joined the family for breakfast, discussing household matters with Satyrus, helping Ambrose with his studies, being present and engaged and absolutely unreachable. She wore simple clothes that marked her status but didn't call undue attention. She attended family gatherings but deflected marriage proposals with a smile that could freeze wine. "You're making us look strange," Satyrus complained, after yet another awkward dinner where guests didn't know how to address his virgin sister. "At least if you joined a convent, people would understand. This half-in, half-out existence confuses everyone." "Good," Marcelina replied. "Confusion creates space for new possibilities. If people understood exactly what I was, they'd have a box to put me in. This way, I remain indefinable, uncategorizable, free." She used that freedom to study. While Roman matrons spent their afternoons managing slaves and planning dinner parties, Marcelina learned Greek and Hebrew. While they gossiped about marriages and scandals, she corresponded with theologians across the empire. While they bred the next generation of Romans, she was writing commentaries on scripture that would influence her brother's future sermons. Because that was the secret revolution hidden in plain sight. Ambrose, future bishop and doctor of the church, was being educated by his virgin sister. She taught him rhetoric when tutors failed to inspire him. She introduced him to the deeper mysteries of faith when he might have settled for surface piety. She showed him through her own example that Christianity could be more than just Rome with different gods. "Why do you live like this?" he asked her once, finding her in her room at midnight, surrounded by texts, writing by candlelight. "You could have married well, had children, been happy." "I am happy," she said, setting down her pen. "Happier than any married woman I know." "They're all dying, Ambrose, slowly, quietly, but dying nonetheless, crushed under the weight of their husbands' expectations and their children's needs. I chose a different death, to the world's expectations, and found life instead." Years passed. Ambrose grew into his destiny, becoming first a governor, then unexpectedly Bishop of Milan. And through it all, Marcellina remained his anchor. But her influence extended beyond her famous brother. Other women began seeking her out. Young girls facing unwanted marriages, widows being pressured to remarry, women who sensed that there might be another way, but couldn't imagine what it looked like. Marcellina showed them, not by preaching, but by living, by being visible in her difference, by proving daily that a woman could choose God and remain in the world, transforming both through her presence. She created an informal network of consecrated virgins living in their families' homes. Not a formal order. That would have required male oversight, official approval, the kind of structure that turned freedom into another kind of cage. Instead, a loose fellowship of women who'd found the narrow path between total withdrawal and total capitulation. They supported each other through letters, through visits, through the simple knowledge that they weren't alone in their strange choice. "You're creating a new kind of monasticism," one visiting bishop observed, watching Marcellina orchestrate a gathering of her virgin network. "Not withdrawn from the world, but embedded in it. Not separate, but integrated. It's unsettling." "The gospel is unsettling," Marcellina replied calmly. "If our faith doesn't disturb the comfortable patterns of the world, we're probably doing it wrong." She lived to see Ambrose become one of the most influential bishops in the Western Church. Lived to see her informal network of household virgins become an accepted, even honored way of life. Lived to see the ideas she'd quietly nurtured take root and bloom across the empire. But she never sought recognition, never wrote treatises defending her choice, never became the kind of public figure her brother was. Instead, she remained what she'd chosen to be that Christmas Eve in the tomb. A consecrated virgin living in creative tension with the world. Present but untouchable, engaged but unbought. Visible proof that women could choose their own sacred path and walk it within the very heart of the secular world. When she died at 70, Ambrose himself preached at her funeral. He spoke of her learning, her dedication, her influence on his own faith. But the women in the congregation heard something else in his words. Gratitude mixed with grief for the sister who'd shown him that holiness had a feminine face, that virginity was not absence, but presence, that choosing God over marriage could be the most radical act of all. They buried her in the same family tomb where she'd taken her vows. Among the women who'd had no choice, they laid the one who'd chosen everything. And if the dead could speak, perhaps they thanked her. For breaking the chain, for proving it could be done, for showing that even surrounded by tradition and expectation and the weight of centuries, a woman could still choose to be free. The tomb sealed, the mourners dispersed, but Marcelina's revolution continued. In every household where a consecrated virgin chose to remain, transforming family life through her presence. In every woman who looked at marriage and said, "No, I choose something else." In every girl who saw that virginity could be power, that faith could be freedom, that living in the world didn't mean belonging to it. She'd entered a tomb to take her vows and emerged more alive than ever. The paradox at the heart of her choice, death to live, withdrawal to engage, submission to be free, became the template for a new kind of female monasticism. One that didn't require deserts or convents or complete separation. Just women brave enough to stand in the center of the world and refuse to be what it expected. The consecrated virgin in the family tomb had become a door. And through that door, countless women would walk into lives they could finally call their own. The tomb's door closes on one revolution, while in Jerusalem, the wealthiest widow in the empire counts gold coins by lamplight, calculating exactly how much freedom costs. The gold covered her table like a molten sea, coins bearing the faces of dead emperors who'd never imagined their profiles would fund a woman's escape from everything they built. Melania counted mechanically, her fingers black with the tarnish of old money, sorting wealth that could buy provinces into bags that would buy freedom. 22 years old, widow of 3 months, owner of estates that sprawled across the empire like an octopus made of land deeds and human chattel. The wealthiest woman in Rome, they called her. The most trapped, she called herself. The deaths had come like dominoes falling. First, her 5-year-old son, burning with fever that no amount of gold could cool. Then her 3-year-old, following his brother as if death were a game they were playing together. Finally, her husband. The mourning visits had barely ended when the marriage proposals began. Senators, generals, men who looked at her grief and saw opportunity, who calculated her sorrow against her estates and found the mathematics favorable. They came with their contracts and their promises, their assurances that new children would heal the wound of the lost ones, that a new husband would make her forget the one who'd chosen death over life without his sons. Melania had smiled at them all, served them wine in cups that cost more than villages, and felt something inside her turn to stone, or perhaps to fire. It was hard to tell the difference when rage and emptiness burned with the same cold flame. That's when she'd started counting. Not just the gold, though that was part of it, but everything. The estates in Spain and Africa, the slaves in Sicily and Gaul, the trading contracts and tax farms, the urban properties and rural holdings, the vast machinery of wealth that her husband's family had spent centuries accumulating, and that had fallen to her like an avalanche. She counted it all, cataloged it with the same methodical precision she'd once used to manage household accounts. Except now, she wasn't managing. She was calculating the price of total divestment. "You've lost your mind," her cousin Petronius informed her when he discovered what she was doing. He'd appointed himself her guardian in the absence of male relatives, a role that consisted mainly of trying to arrange her remarriage to his business partners. "Grief has disturbed your reason. No one gives away a fortune like yours. It's not done." "Everything is not done until someone does it," Melania replied, not looking up from her ledgers. The first person to walk upright probably looked insane to those still crawling. She'd heard about the monasteries in the East through whispered conversations at Christian gatherings, places where women lived by their own rules, where wealth was communal and poverty a choice rather than a catastrophe. But more than that, she'd heard about the scholarship happening there. Women learning Hebrew, studying scripture in its original languages, corresponding with theologians as equals. The intellectual life she'd always craved, but that Rome deemed inappropriate for anyone with a womb. The plan formed slowly, crystallizing like salt from seawater. She would liquidate everything. Every last coin, every last estate, every last slave would be converted to portable wealth or freed. Then she would leave Rome forever, build a monastery in Jerusalem where Christ had walked, and spend whatever years remained to her in study and prayer. But first, she had to untangle the golden chains that bound her. The slaves were easiest. Paradoxically, Roman law allowed owners to free their human property, and Melania did so with an efficiency that shocked the markets. Thousands of freed slaves flooded the labor market in a single month, driving down wages and disrupting the careful economics of exploitation. She gave each one a purse of gold, enough to start new lives, not enough to make them targets. Some cursed her for throwing them into uncertain freedom. Others wept with gratitude. She accepted both responses with equal calm. The estates were harder. Land meant power in Rome, and powerful men didn't like watching a woman dismantle power structures they might have inherited. Petronius tried legal action, claiming she was incompetent to manage such vast holdings. Melania countered by hiring the best lawyers in Rome, women-friendly Christians who understood what she was trying to do and helped her navigate the legal maze. She sold to outsiders whenever possible: Syrian merchants, Egyptian traders, anyone who would take Roman land out of Roman hands. Each sale was a small betrayal of the empire that had taken her children, her husband, her hope of ordinary happiness. She felt no gate. Rome had betrayed her first by teaching her that women existed to breed and mourn in equal measure. The liquidation took a year of battles with relatives who saw family wealth evaporating. A year of negotiations with buyers who couldn't believe she was serious. A year of fending off increasingly desperate suitors who tried everything from poetry to kidnapping to secure her remaining fortune. Through it all, Melania moved like a woman possessed, which she was in a way. Possessed by a vision of freedom that made all opposition seem trivial. "Where will you go?" Petronius asked when it became clear he couldn't stop her. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by something like bewildered respect. "What will you do?" "I'll go where learning is valued more than breeding," Melania replied, signing the last document that dissolved the last estate. "I'll do what Roman women aren't supposed to do: think, write, study, pray, and die without ever being anyone's property again." She left Rome on a March morning, when the city was drunk on spring and its own eternal importance. No fanfare, no grand farewell. Just a woman in simple clothes, boarding a ship with a few attendants and enough gold to build something new. She stood at the rail as the harbor receded, watching the city that had made and unmade her shrink to a smudge on the horizon. "Regrets?" asked Rufinus, the scholar she'd hired to accompany her. He alone understood what she was attempting. Not just physical relocation, but intellectual transformation. "Only that I didn't do it sooner," Melania replied. "I spent 3 years being the grieving widow Rome expected. 3 years I could have spent learning, building, becoming. But perhaps grief was necessary. Perhaps I needed to lose everything that mattered to understand that what Rome offers never mattered at all." The journey to Jerusalem took months. Months of seasickness and strange ports, of languages she didn't speak and customs she didn't understand. But also months of freedom. No one knew her. No one expected anything from her except payment for passage. She could be anyone, could become anyone. The widow's weeds came off. The elaborate hairstyles simplified. By the time they reached Jerusalem, Melania looked like what she was becoming. A woman with purpose rather than pedigree. Jerusalem overwhelmed and inspired in equal measure. The city where Christ had died blazed with a mixture of piety and commerce that felt both sacred and profane. Pilgrims and merchants, mystics and thieves, all jumbled together in streets that had seen too much history to be impressed by any individual drama. Melania loved it immediately. Here was a place where transformation was possible, where past identities could be shed like old clothes. She bought land on the Mount of Olives, not prime real estate. The Romans and Greeks had claimed that, but a rocky outcrop with a view of the city and enough space for her vision. The monastery she built was revolutionary in its simplicity. No grand architecture, no ostentatious decoration, just functional buildings arranged around a central courtyard where women could walk and think and argue about God. The first recruits came slowly. Local women, mostly widows and virgins who'd heard about the wealthy Roman building something different. They expected another exercise in aristocratic piety, a rich woman playing at holiness while maintaining her luxuries. Instead, they found Melania living in a cell identical to theirs, eating the same simple food, wearing the same rough clothes. The only difference was in her library, already growing with texts in Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and Syriac. "We study here," she told each new arrival, "not just scripture, but everything. Philosophy, mathematics, natural science, languages. I spent 22 years with a mind Rome thought was only good for calculating household accounts. Here, we calculate the distance to heaven and find it shorter than anyone imagined." The community grew. 20 women, 40, 60. Not just refugees from the empire, but local women, Eastern women who brought their own traditions and insights. The monastery became a crossroads of female scholarship, where Roman logic met Eastern mysticism and created something new. Melania instituted practices that scandalized even other monasteries. Debate sessions where women argued theology like philosophers. Correspondence networks that connected her monastery to female scholars across the known world. Translation projects that made obscure texts available to those who couldn't read the originals. She was creating not just a monastery, but a university. a place where female intelligence could flourish without apology. You go too far. Jerome wrote from Bethlehem, where Paula had established her own monastery. Women studying is one thing. Women teaching is another. You risk attracting the wrong kind of attention. I've had the right kind of attention my whole life, Melania wrote back. It nearly killed me. I'll take my chances with the wrong kind. The wrong kind came, predictably. Bishops uncomfortable with women who could argue scripture better than they could. Theologians who found their errors corrected by female scholars. Traditional monastics who thought contemplation should be silent, not sharp with intellectual engagement. They complained, threatened, tried to impose male oversight on Melania's radical experiment. She outlasted them all, partly through sheer wealth, even after her massive divestment. She'd kept enough to ensure her monastery's independence, partly through political skill learned in Roman salons, but mostly through the simple expedient of being right. Her scholars produced better translations. Her theologians offered keener insights. Her monastery's reputation for learning drew pilgrims from across the empire. "How do you bear it?" a young recruit asked her once. "The isolation, the criticism, the constant battle to be taken seriously." Melania looked up from the text she was translating, Origen's commentary on the Song of Songs, dangerous material that danced on the edge of heresy. "I buried 2 children and a husband in the space of a year. Everything since has been easy by comparison. Besides, I'm not isolated. I'm surrounded by minds that challenge mine, by women who understand that thinking is a form of prayer. As for being taken seriously, I don't need their approval. I have my own." She lived another 20 years on that mountain, watching her monastery become a beacon for female intellectuals. Women who'd been told their minds were too weak for serious study came and discovered they could master languages, parse philosophical arguments, contribute to theological debates that shaped the Church's future. The golden chains she'd dissolved had been transformed into something better, a golden thread of learning that connected women across cultures and centuries. When she died, they found her in the library, slumped over a half-finished translation. The text was from Ecclesiastes. "Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body." But she'd added her own note in the margin. "The body wearies so the soul can soar. This is the exchange I gladly make." They buried her on the Mount of Olives, within sight of the city where Christ had died and risen. Her monastery continued for centuries, through conquests and crusades, always maintaining its character as a place where women's minds were as valued as their prayers. The library she'd built became legendary, preserving texts that would have been lost, producing scholars who would shape Christian thought for generations. But her greatest legacy wasn't in the buildings or the books. It was in the proof she'd offered that a woman could take the worst life could offer and transform it into purpose. That wealth could be converted to freedom. That the golden chains of privilege could be melted down and reforged into keys that opened doors for others. Every woman who entered those monastery gates, every scholar who found her voice in those debate sessions, every mind that flowered in that unlikely garden on the Mount of Olives, they were all Melania's true inheritance. Not the gold she'd given away, but the possibilities she'd created. Not the estates she'd sold, but the intellectual territory she'd claimed for women who'd been told they had no right to think. She'd arrived in Jerusalem carrying gold and grief in equal measure. She left it having transformed both into something the empire never expected, a revolution of the mind, led by women who discovered that learning was another way to love God, that scholarship was worship, that a trained intellect was the greatest freedom of all. The golden chains were gone. In their place, something infinitely more valuable. Women thinking, writing, teaching, proving daily that the life of the mind had no gender, that intelligence was the imago Dei that no amount of Roman tradition could suppress. Melania the Elder, they called her, to distinguish her from her granddaughter who would follow a similar path. But she was really Melania the Transformer, the woman who showed that you could sell an empire and buy a different kind of kingdom entirely. Gold transforms to wisdom on all of its slopes, while in Constantinople's palace halls, another widow faces down an emperor who thinks her fortune is his to command. The emperor's messenger arrived at dawn, because power likes to catch you unprepared. Olympias received him in her atrium, still dressed in the simple widow's garb she'd adopted since her husband's death 18 months ago. She knew what was coming. In Constantinople, wealthy widows had the shelf life of fresh fish, best consumed quickly before they spoiled with independence. His Imperial Majesty requests your presence at the palace, the messenger announced. Managing to make a command sound like an invitation. The matter concerns your future happiness. Olympias almost laughed. Her future happiness. As if Theodosius had ever concerned himself with anyone's happiness but his own. As if happiness were something that could be decreed, like tax rates or military conscription. She'd been happy once, for exactly 13 months of marriage to Nebridius before death claimed him. Now she was something better than happy. She was free. Tell His Majesty I will attend him after the morning prayers, she replied, watching the messenger's face twitch at her casual postponement of imperial summons. God's business takes precedence over Caesar's. She used the extra hours to prepare. Not her appearance. Theodosius would get the same austere widow he'd been pressuring for months. But her arguments, her strategies, her resolve. Because she knew what this summons meant. The emperor had found another husband for her. Another political alliance to be cemented with her body and her gold. Another man who saw her fortune and thought it came with flesh attached. The palace blazed with the kind of wealth that was meant to intimidate. Gold everywhere, on the walls, the ceilings, the guards' armor. An obscene display of power that made the gospel's eye of the needle seem less metaphor than architectural challenge. Olympias walked through it untouched. She'd grown up in this world, daughter of count, niece of bishops. The glitter didn't blind her anymore. Theodosius received her in his private chamber, a calculated insult. Public audiences were for people who mattered politically. Private meetings were for problems to be solved discreetly. He lounged on his couch like a well-fed cat, purple silk pooling around him like spilled wine. Olympias, he began without preamble, your mourning has lasted long enough. The empire has need of your resources. The empire has need of many things, Olympias replied, remaining standing. To sit would acknowledge his right to keep her here. justice, mercy, care for the poor. Which of these does my remarriage serve?" The emperor's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to resistance, especially from women. "Don't play games. You know how this works. Elpidius is a good match. Spanish blood, military connections, loyalty to the throne. He'll manage your estates wisely. My estates are already managed wisely, by me." "Women don't manage estates. They oversee households until their husbands." "I have no husband. By God's grace and death's intervention, I am sui juris, legally independent, free to manage my own affairs without male oversight." She pulled a scroll from her robes. "Would you like to see the accounts? I've increased revenues by 30% while reducing the suffering of my tenants. Perhaps Elpidius should be asking me for management advice." Theodosius stood, his casual pose abandoned. "You forget yourself. I am not asking. The marriage will take place. The contracts are already drawn. Then tear them up." Olympius met his gaze steadily. "I will not marry again. Not Elpidius. Not anyone. I've made vows to Christ that supersede any earthly authority. Vows can be dissolved. The bishops." "Which bishops?" "My uncle Nectarius, who baptized you? Amphilochius, who counseled your father? Gregory, who established the very theology you claim to defend. Should I write to them about your plan to force a consecrated widow into violating her vows? I'm sure they'd find it theologically interesting." The threat hung between them like a blade. Theodosius was emperor, but his power rested partly on church support. A scandal involving forced marriage of a prominent Christian widow, niece of bishops, known for her charity. It would be politically disastrous. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "I've been patient, gentle. But there are other ways to ensure compliance. Your wealth makes you valuable, but it also makes you vulnerable." "Then take it," Olympius said simply. The words seemed to surprise them both. Theodosius blinked, uncertain he'd heard correctly. But Olympius felt the rightness of it, the perfect solution forming even as she spoke. "Take my wealth," she repeated. "All of it. Every estate, every business, every coin. Put it under imperial administration. Freeze my accounts. Reduce me to nothing. But know this, you'll be stealing from Christ himself. Every coin in my treasury is marked for God's work. Every estate feeds the poor. Every business supports widows and orphans. Take it all and let Constantinople see what kind of Christian emperor steals from the church to fund his wars. You're bluffing." "Try me," she smiled then, the dangerous smile of a woman with nothing left to lose. "I've been preparing for this moment since Nebridius died. Every donation documented. Every charity registered with the church. Bishop Nectarios has copies of everything. So does John Chrysostom in Antioch. You know, the priest they call the Bolden-Tongued, whose sermons reach every corner of the empire. Imagine what he could do with a story about an emperor who robbed a widow to force her into marriage." Theodosius's face had gone the color of old parchment. He was trapped, and they both knew it. Force the marriage and face ecclesiastical scandal. Seize her wealth and face the same. Let her go and appear weak. There were no good options, which was exactly how Olympius had planned it. "You've thought of everything," he said finally. "I've had 18 months of widowhood to think. You'd be surprised what women can accomplish when we're not being bred like prize mares." "Fine." The word came out like something rotten being spit up. "Keep your independence, keep your wealth, but don't think this makes you untouchable. Constantinople is my city. Cross me again, and what? You'll exile me? Please do. I'll build a monastery wherever you send me. Kill me? I'll die a virgin martyr, and you'll have a saint's blood on your hands. There's nothing you can threaten me with that's worse than the marriage you tried to impose." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Theodosius, I'll be converting my city mansion into a monastery, right next to the cathedral, where everyone can see what a woman can do with freedom and faith. I'll call it the Alupius Monastery. Has a nice ring, don't you think?" She left him there, purple with rage and impotence, the most powerful man in the Eastern Empire, defeated by a woman's simple no. The transformation of her mansion began immediately. Olympias had been planning this too, her real response to the marriage pressure. Within days, walls came down, cells went up, and the palace that had hosted Constantinople's elite became a refuge for women seeking God. The speed of change stunned the city. One week, Olympias was hosting dinner parties in halls dripping with gold. The next, those same halls echoed with psalms as 50 women moved in, turning luxury into liturgy. She kept nothing for herself. No special quarters, no private luxuries. Her cell was identical to the newest postulants. Her clothes were the same rough wool. Her food came from the same common pot. "Why?" Bishop Nectarios asked, visiting his transformed niece. "You could have had both, marriage to a powerful man and influence through him. Why choose this radical poverty?" "Because compromise is what they expect from women," Olympias replied, showing him through the converted halls. "We're supposed to negotiate our captivity, not reject it entirely. But I've seen what compromise costs. My mother died bearing her 9th child for a husband who couldn't remember her favorite flower. My sister smiles through banquets while her husband's mistresses wear jewels bought with her dowry. That's compromise. I choose clarity." The monastery grew rapidly, too rapidly for Constantinople's comfort. Women arrived daily, widows escaping remarriage, virgins fleeing arranged matches, wives whose husbands had conveniently died or disappeared. Each one a small scandal. Together, they were revolution. Olympias instituted a rule that blended Egyptian asceticism with Greek learning, prayer and study in equal measure, manual labor that ignored class distinctions, aristocrats scrubbing floors beside former slaves, common property that erased the boundaries between rich and poor. And at the center, a fierce commitment to female self-determination that made bishops nervous and emperors furious. "You're creating disorder," John Chrysostom warned during one of his visits. He admired Olympias, but worried about her radicalism. "The city talks of nothing but your monastery. Women abandoning their duties, daughters defying fathers, wives leaving husbands." "Good," Olympias said. "When order means oppression, disorder becomes holy. Besides, I'm not making them leave. I'm simply providing an option. If so many choose it, perhaps the problem isn't with my monastery, but with the marriages they're fleeing." She had a point. The stream of refugees spoke to something rotten in Constantinople's golden facade. Women arrived with stories that would have been commonplace if they weren't so horrible. Beatings presented as discipline, rapes disguised as wifely duty, pregnancies that killed the mother but never the father's appetite. Each story another indictment of the system that treated women as breeding stock with decorative value. Olympias took them all. The aristocrats and the slaves, the educated and the illiterate, the young virgins and the exhausted mothers. She created a world within the world where different rules applied, where women could speak in assembly, where their opinions mattered, where their bodies were their own. The inevitable backlash came from multiple directions. Husbands demanding their wives back, fathers insisting their daughters return. The emperor, still smarting from his earlier defeat, looking for any excuse to shut down this feminine revolution happening in plain sight. They tried legal challenges. Olympias had better lawyers. They tried ecclesiastical pressure. She had bishops in her family and theologians in her debt. They tried social ostracism. She laughed and noted that ostracism required caring about society's opinion, which she'd stopped doing the day Theodosius tried to sell her. You can't fight the entire system, even sympathetic friends warned. One woman, one monastery, it's not enough to change anything. "Watch me," Olympias replied. And they did. Watched as her monastery became a power center that rivaled the palace. Watched as she used her still vast wealth to fund hospitals, orphanages, churches that operated on the radical principle that women were fully human. Watched as her example inspired similar foundations across the empire. Women taking control of their own spiritual lives, creating spaces where they could exist as more than wives and mothers. The cost was high. Olympias aged rapidly under the strain of constant battle. Her health, never strong, weakened from the fasts and vigils she imposed on herself. The weight of 200 women's lives, their struggles and sorrows and small triumphs, carved lines in her face that made her look ancient at 30. But she never wavered, never remarried, never compromised. When John Chrysostom became Bishop of Constantinople, she was his strongest supporter and fiercest critic, pushing him to remember that Christ's liberation included women. When he was exiled for his reforms, she supported him with letters and gold, maintaining correspondence that would later be studied as theological literature. "Do you regret it?" he asked in one letter. "The life you could have had?" "I'm living the life I could have had," she wrote back. "This is it. This monastery full of difficult women and endless problems and small victories that remake the world one soul at a time. What you mean is, do I regret not living the life others wanted for me? And no, I don't regret that at all." She died at 42, worn out by work and conflict, but victorious in all the ways that mattered. The monastery survived her, evolved beyond her, became an institution that would last centuries. But more than that, the idea survived that women could say no to the entire system, could refuse to play the game, could create their own spaces, their own rules, their own relationships with God and each other. Theodosius outlived her, but his power died first. Because every woman who entered Olympias's monastery, every no spoken to an unwanted marriage, every life lived in defiance of expectation, they all chipped away at the absolute authority he thought he possessed. He'd wanted to force one woman into marriage. Instead, he'd created a martyr for female independence whose example would outlive his empire. The price of no had been everything: her comfort, her health, her social position. But the reward was also everything: her freedom, her integrity, her legacy of lives transformed. Olympias had learned what every revolutionary discovers: that the most powerful word in any language is also the shortest. No, said firmly, said repeatedly, said with your whole life, until the world finally stops asking and starts listening. The emperor's palace fades to silence, while in Cappadocia, a mother watches her daughter reject marriage and wonders if she's witnessing the future or mourning the past. Emilia never wanted to marry. This was her secret, buried deeper than the family's silver, more carefully hidden than her father's debts. In 4th century Cappadocia, girls who didn't want to marry were like birds who didn't want to fly, unnatural, broken, requiring correction. So she smiled when they paraded suitors past her, blushed appropriately when marriage contracts were discussed, played the role of marriageable daughter so perfectly that no one suspected the revolt brewing in her chest. But the body has its own honesty. Every time a potential husband visited, Emilia developed mysterious illnesses. Headaches that lasted precisely as long as the negotiations. Stomach troubles that cleared the moment the suitor left. Her mother called in physicians who found nothing wrong. Her father raged about the expense of treating imaginary ailments. Only Emilia knew the truth. Her body was trying to save her from a life it couldn't bear. She might have succeeded in staying single through sheer psychosomatic resistance, if not for Basil. He was different from the others, quieter, more interested in her mind than her dowry. A lawyer who quoted philosophy over dinner and seemed genuinely curious about her thoughts. When he visited, Emilia's body forgot to manufacture symptoms. Betrayed by her own flesh, she found herself married at 17. The wedding night taught her what all women learned but none spoke aloud. That marriage was a sanctioned violence, a repeated small death. But here's where Emilia's story turns strange. Because in accepting what she couldn't change, she discovered she could change everything else. If she must be a wife, she would be a different kind. If she must be a mother, she would mother differently. If she must live the life she never wanted, she would transform it from the inside out. The pregnancies came like waves, 10 in 15 years. Each one a new negotiation with death, a fresh reminder that women's bodies were battlegrounds where life and mortality waged their endless war. She lost 3 in infancy, tiny graves that marked the price of perpetual fertility. But 7 survived, and in those 7, Emilia saw her chance. She would raise revolutionaries. It started with education. Not just for the boys, that was expected in their social class, but for the girls too. The same curriculum, the same expectations. When Basil questioned the expense of Greek tutors for daughters, Emilia responded with scripture he couldn't refute. In Christ, there is neither male nor female. If souls were equal before God, minds deserved equal cultivation. But education was just the beginning. The real revolution happened in the stories she told. The examples she lifted up, the possibilities she planted like seeds in her children's minds. While other mothers spoke of good marriages and many children, Emilia told tales of desert mothers and virgin martyrs. While others prepared their daughters for submission, she taught them theology and rhetoric. While others saw virginity as a failure to marry, she presented it as a choice that could shake empires. Her eldest daughter, Matrona, was the first to bloom under this strange mothering. At 12, when her betrothed died, Matrona announced she would never marry again. Another mother might have forced the issue, beaten the rebellion out of her, starved her into compliance. Amelia did something unprecedented. She supported her daughter's choice. "You understand what this means?" she asked Matrona privately. "The life you're choosing will be harder than marriage, lonelier. The world will call you unnatural." "The world calls you unnatural for educating daughters," Matrona replied. "Yet here we are, reading Plato in a world that thinks we should only read household accounts." Amelia pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair. This child who would never have children, this daughter who would never know daughterhood. "Then let us be unnatural together." A scandal rocked Cappadocian society. Basil the Elder's daughter refusing marriage, and the mother supporting this madness? Relatives arrived to talk sense. Priests came to counsel proper female behavior. Amelia met them all with scripture than logic, defending her daughter's choice with the fierce intelligence she'd been forced to hide for so long. But the real shock came when Amelia went further. She didn't just defend Matrona's choice, she facilitated it. When Matrona wanted to transform part of the family estate into a religious community, Amelia convinced Basil to allow it. When Matrona needed books, teachers, connections to other religious women, Amelia provided them. She became the architect of her daughter's virginity, building the structures that would support a life she herself could never live. "Why?" Basil asked one night, finding his wife in Matrona's library, copying texts by lamplight. "Why encourage this? She could marry well, give us grandchildren, continue the family line." Amelia set down her pen and looked at this man who'd shared her bed for 20 years without ever knowing her heart. "I've given you 7 children, Basil. I've nearly died bringing life into this world more times than you can imagine. Let me give one daughter to a different future. Let me see what a woman can become when she's not constantly pregnant or recovering from pregnancy." "You regret our children?" "I regret that they came at such cost. I regret that my body has been a battlefield where your legacy was won with my blood. I regret many things, husband, but not this, not giving Matrona the choice I never had." The words hung between them like a blade. Basil saw his wife clearly, for perhaps the first time, not the compliant matron he'd thought he'd married, but a woman who'd spent decades transforming captivity into something else. He could have raged, could have beaten her, could have locked Matrona away until she agreed to marry. Instead, he did something that surprised them both. He yielded. "Keep your virgin daughter," he said quietly, "but the others will marry normally." Amelia agreed, knowing it was a lie, because she was already working on the others. Her sons, Basil, Gregory, and Peter, showed inclinations toward religious life. She nurtured those inclinations with carefully chosen tutors, strategic exposure to theological debates, constant reminders that greatness came in many forms. Her younger daughters watched Matrona's community grow and saw possibilities beyond marriage. She was creating a new kind of family, one where virginity and marriage coexisted, where choosing God was as valid as choosing a husband, where women's minds were cultivated regardless of their reproductive futures. It was subversive in its quiet radicalism, revolutionary in its domestic scope. When Basil died of a weak heart, though some said it was exhaustion from trying to understand his strange family, everyone expected Amelia to remarry. A widow with property and connections was valuable currency in the marriage market. Instead, she did something that shocked even Matrona. She joined her daughter's religious community. "But you're not a virgin," confused visitors pointed out, as if the 11 pregnancies weren't evidence enough. "Virginity isn't about what you've done with your body," Emilia replied. "It's about what you choose to do with your future. I choose to spend my remaining years as something other than a wife or mother. Call it whatever you like." The transformation was remarkable. The woman who'd spent 30 years managing pregnancies and households became a scholar. The mother who'd raised revolutionaries became one herself. She learned Hebrew at 50, wrote commentaries at 60, engaged in theological debates that her sons would later claim as their own insights, though they knew better. Her children watched this metamorphosis with awe and some discomfort. Their mother, who'd seemed so conventional, revealing depths they'd never suspected. Their teacher in rebellion, showing them she'd been the greatest rebel all along, playing the system from inside, using marriage and motherhood as cover for the most successful subversion imaginable. 3 of her sons became bishops, the famous Cappadocian fathers whose theology would shape Christianity for centuries. Her daughter Matrona became a teacher and monastic founder whose influence rivaled any bishop's. Her other children chose their own paths, some marriage, some religious life, all marked by the radical notion that choice was possible. "How did you do it?" Gregory asked her once, visiting the community where his mother now lived as a simple sister. "How did you raise us all to question everything while seeming to question nothing?" Emilia smiled, her face lined with years but her eyes sharp as ever. "By remembering that revolution doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like compliance. Sometimes it looks like teaching your daughters Greek while pretending it's just to help with household management. Sometimes it looks like raising children who don't know they're being raised as revolutionaries until it's too late to be anything else." She lived to see her family transform Cappadocian Christianity, lived to see virginity become not just acceptable, but admirable, lived to see women's communities flourish across the empire, many of them founded by women who'd heard about Matrona and Emilia, the daughter who chose God and the mother who made it possible. Weren't opposites, that you could bear children and bear witness to alternatives, that raising the next generation could be an act of revolution if you are willing to plant seeds of possibility in your children's minds. When she died at 70, surrounded by daughters both biological and spiritual, her last words were typically practical. "Remember, the future is always born in the homes of those who seem most traditional. Watch the mothers. They're the ones who change the world while everyone's looking elsewhere." They buried her next to Basil, the husband she'd never wanted, but had transformed into an unwitting accomplice in revolution. The epitaph read simply, "Emilia, Mother." But everyone who knew her understood meant more than biological motherhood. She'd been mother to a movement, midwife to a new way of being Christian, creator of space for choices she herself could never make. Her children carried on her work, most of them never fully understanding that their famous theologies and celebrated communities all began in the heart of a woman who'd wanted to be a virgin, but became a mother instead, who'd taken the life forced on her and transformed it into a laboratory for liberation, who'd proven that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is raise children who don't know that the world expects them to be ordinary. Emilia the mother who gave birth to virginity, not through her own body's refusal, but through her daughter's choices. Not through dramatic rebellion, but through patient cultivation of possibility. She'd spent her life creating what she couldn't have. Freedom, choice, self-determination for women. And in creating it for others, she'd found her own kind of liberation. 1. The married mother who made virginity possible. The traditionalist who raised revolutionaries. The woman who proved that you could work within the system to destroy the system, one carefully educated child at a time. Some revolutions are loud. Others are as quiet as a mother teaching her daughter to read, slipping in lessons about desert mothers between the household accounts, planting seeds of possibility that won't bloom until she's gone. Emilia's revolution was the quiet kind, which is why it lasted. A mother's revolutionary seeds take root across an empire, while in the eastern deserts, a movement becomes a multitude, as women discover that choosing God means choosing themselves. By the year 400, something extraordinary had happened. The eastern deserts, those vast stretches of nothing that sensible people avoided, had become cities without walls, populated by women who discovered that nothing was exactly what they needed. They came in ones and twos at first, following rumors and dreams. By the turn of the century, they came in hundreds, transforming wasteland into the strangest garden the world had ever seen. One that bloomed with human souls instead of flowers. Stand on any high place in the Egyptian desert that year, and you'd see them. Clusters of cells dotting the landscape like anthills, paths worn between communities by sandaled feet, smoke rising from 1,000 small fires, where women who'd rejected the world's warmth created their own. The desert had become feminine, not in the soft way Rome imagined femininity, but in the fierce way of women who'd chosen their own hard path. They called them by different names in different places. Ammas in Egypt, holy virgins in Syria, consecrated women in Palestine. But the names mattered less than the reality. Thousands of women living outside male control, creating their own rules, their own relationships with God, their own definitions of what a woman's life could be. Mary of Egypt was one of them, though her story broke all the patterns. She'd been a prostitute in Alexandria. Not the sacred kind, but the common kind, selling her body for bread, and sometimes just for the momentary power of being desired. But something happened at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The crowd pressed forward to venerate the true cross, and Mary found herself unable to enter. Not physically prevented, something else, something that made her legs refuse to carry her across the threshold. She stood there, watching pilgrims stream past, and understood with sudden clarity that she was seeing her life from the outside. All the men, all the transactions, all the small deaths she'd sold herself into. 47 years she lived in that desert. 47 years of solitude so complete that when the monk Zosimus found her, she'd almost forgotten how to speak. Her clothes had rotted away, replaced by hair grown long and wild. Her skin had become leather. She looked like the desert had digested her and produced something new, neither fully human nor fully spirit, but something in between. "How do you survive?" Zosimus asked, offering his cloak to cover her nakedness. "I eat what the desert provides," Mary replied. her voice rusty with disuse. "But you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't how I survive. It's why I never lived until I came here." Her story spread because stories of transformation always do. The prostitute who became a hermit. The woman who sold her body, reclaiming it through solitude. The sinner who out-holied the saints. Other women heard it and recognized something. Not the prostitution necessarily, but the transformation. The possibility of complete reinvention. The hope that the past could be not just forgiven, but obliterated. Replaced by a present so intense it burned away everything that came before. Theodora's story was different, but equally radical. She'd fled to the desert disguised as a man, entering a male monastery as Brother Theodore. For years she lived the deception, binding her breasts, deepening her voice, out-fasting and out-praying the monks around her. When a woman from the nearby town accused Brother Theodore of fathering her child, impossible, obviously, but believable to monks ready to think the worst of each other, Theodora accepted the accusation rather than reveal her identity. 7 years she raised that child, letting everyone believe she was a fallen monk rather than compromise her disguise. Only when she died did the truth come out, the monks preparing her body for burial and discovering what she'd hidden so carefully. A woman among them all along. A woman who'd beaten them at their own ascetic game. A woman who'd proven that holiness had no gender, just bodies willing to suffer for God. The scandal should have ended there. But something unexpected happened. Other women began arriving at the monastery, asking to follow Theodora's path. Not disguised as men, that secret was out, but openly, as women who'd proven they could match any monk's dedication. The monastery resisted at first, then yielded to the inevitable. Within a decade, it had become a double monastery, men and women living in parallel communities, separated by walls, but united in purpose. This was happening everywhere by 400 AD. The strict separation of male and female religious life, so carefully maintained in the early years, was breaking down under the sheer pressure of women's determination. They were everywhere in the desert now, building their own loras, joining male communities as equals, creating new forms of religious life that no one had imagined possible. Syncletica's community near Alexandria had grown from a handful of women in caves to a small city of cells. Her sayings were collected alongside those of the Desert Fathers, though always fewer. Not because she spoke less wisdom, but because male scribes recorded less of it. Still, what survived was enough to show a different approach to desert spirituality. Where the men often competed in ascetic extremes, Syncletica taught moderation. Where they emphasized individual struggle, she fostered community. Where they fought demons with violence, she counseled patience. The desert isn't our enemy, she taught her followers. It's our teacher. It strips away everything unnecessary until only the essential remains. But be careful. Sometimes what seems essential is just another layer of ego. Even holiness can become a possession we must learn to release. In Syria, the women took different forms. Some became stylites like their male counterparts, living on pillars that raised them between earth and heaven. Others created urban monasteries, transforming family homes into sacred spaces. The Syrian tradition emphasized visibility. These women wanted to be seen in their holiness, wanted their choice witnessed by the world they rejected. Sarah of the desert spent 60 years living near a river, battling what she called the demon of fornication. Not because she desired men, she'd left that behind decades ago, but because the memory of desire haunted her, appearing in dreams and visions, reminding her of the life she'd fled. Her saying became famous: "If I prayed God to take this struggle from me, I would have no contest. It is through struggle that I receive my crown." She understood what many didn't: that the desert wasn't about achieving perfect purity, but about engaging in perfect struggle. The women who lasted weren't those who found peace, but those who made peace with permanent war. War against memory, war against desire, war against the thousand small voices that whispered you could go back, rejoin the world, choose comfort over this endless sand. Pelagia's story offered another model. She'd been an actress in Antioch, which meant she was barely a step above prostitution in social hierarchy. Actresses displayed their bodies, inflamed men's desires, existed in the dangerous space between entertainment and availability. When Bishop Nun saw her passing in the street, adorned in jewels and surrounded by admirers, he wept. "Why do you weep?" his fellow bishops asked. "Because she takes more care to adorn herself for earthly lovers than I take to prepare my soul for the heavenly bridegroom," he replied. Pelagia heard about his tears and was intrigued. An old man weeping over a young woman's beauty usually meant desire. But this was different. He wept for her soul, for the person underneath the performance. She sought him out, received baptism, and then did something unprecedented. She didn't join a women's community. Instead, she disguised herself as a male hermit and lived alone on the Mount of Olives, known as Brother Pelagius. Only after her death did anyone discover the truth. Another woman who'd proven that holiness transcended gender. Another scandal that became inspiration. By 400 AD, the examples had multiplied beyond counting. Women who'd found 1,000 different ways to choose God over the world's plans for them. A variety was staggering. In Egypt alone, you could find every possible expression of female monasticism. Anchorites walled into cells, communicating with the world through tiny windows. Cenobites living in vast communities with hundreds of sisters. Wandering hermits who moved constantly, owning nothing but the sky above them. Urban virgins who stayed with their families but lived by monastic rules, each finding her own way to say no to the world's expectations. The rules they created were as varied as their lives. Some communities emphasized literacy, producing women who could debate theology with any bishop. Others focused on manual labor, believing that working with their hands brought them closer to God. Some practiced extreme fasting. Others believed that moderation was its own asceticism. The diversity that would later be forced into uniformity was still wild, experimental, free. But patterns emerged. The importance of economic independence. Nearly every successful community found ways to support itself through craft work, copying manuscripts, or producing goods for sale. The centrality of mutual support. The desert was hard enough without adding isolation. The delicate balance between structure and freedom. Too many rules, and the life became another kind of prison. Too few, and chaos reigned. By 400 AD, female monasticism had become undeniable. The bishops who'd initially resisted had to acknowledge what their eyes could see. thousands of women living productive, holy lives outside the traditional structures. The theologians who'd argued that women needed male oversight had to explain why these communities flourished without it. The empire that had assumed all women would marry had to adjust its calculations. The numbers alone were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that by the turn of the 5th century, tens of thousands of women had chosen monastic life in some form. In certain regions, particularly Egypt and Syria, the percentage of women rejecting marriage for religious life was high enough to cause demographic concerns. Who would bear the next generation if all the women fled to the desert? But that was precisely the point. These women had opted out of the reproductive economy, had refused their role as breeders for the empire, had discovered that their bodies could be fortresses rather than open cities, that their minds could pursue God rather than household management, that their lives could mean something beyond continuing someone else's bloodline. The movement had its critics. John Chrysostom worried about women living without supervision, though he supported their right to choose virginity. Jerome encouraged female scholarship, but insisted it should happen under male guidance. Augustine admired consecrated virgins, but thought they should remain with their families. Even supporters often wanted to contain what they'd helped create. But it was too late for containment. The desert had bloomed with women, and they were putting down roots too deep to be pulled up. They'd created facts on the ground, functioning communities, economic networks, educational systems, theological traditions. They'd proven that female monasticism wasn't an experiment, but an established reality. More importantly, they changed the conversation. By 400 AD, when people spoke of holiness, they had to include women's voices. When they imagined asceticism, they had to acknowledge female models. When they discussed theology, they had to contend with women who'd spent decades contemplating God in the desert and had insights that couldn't be dismissed. The heroic age of female monasticism was ending, giving way to more structured, regulated forms. The wild diversity would be tamed into orders and rules. The radical experiments would solidify into traditions. But for this moment, at the turn of the century, the desert bloomed with 1,000 different flowers, each one a woman who'd chosen her own form of sacred life. Standing in that desert in 400 AD, you could feel the change in the air. These weren't isolated hermits anymore, but a movement. These weren't exceptions to the rule, but rule makers themselves. These weren't women fleeing the world, but women creating new worlds in the wasteland. The desert had always been a place of transformation. Moses met God in the burning bush. Jesus faced temptation in the wilderness. But this transformation was different. Collective rather than individual, feminine rather than masculine, creative rather than destructive. These women weren't just escaping civilization. They were building a new one, cell by cell, prayer by prayer, choice by choice. By choosing nothing, they'd created everything. By rejecting the world's offers, they'd discovered what they actually wanted. By saying no to marriage, motherhood, and conventional femininity, they'd said yes to something larger. The possibility that women could define their own relationship with the divine, create their own communities, write their own rules. The desert bloomed with women, and in that blooming, the world changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but inexorably. Every woman who chose the desert path carved a little more space for the ones who came after. Every community that succeeded proved that alternatives were possible. Every life lived in sacred solitude or holy community declared that women's choices mattered, that their spiritual lives were their own, that between the narrow options the world offered lay vast territories of possibility. This was their gift to the future. Not just the communities they built or the sayings they left behind, but the fundamental proof that women could choose, could create, could thrive outside the structures designed to contain them, could find in the desert's emptiness a fullness the world's plenty had never provided. By 400 AD, that gift was established, irrevocable, written in the sand, but somehow permanent. The desert had bloomed with women, and nothing would ever be quite the same. The desert holds its sacred secrets as our journey through time completes its circle. Listen now as all their voices join in one eternal chorus. And so, dear dreamer, we close the book on the first chapter of female monasticism. From 270 to 400 AD, in the span of just over a century, women rewrote the rules of what a life could be. Did you feel them with you as you drifted toward sleep? These pioneers who chose the desert over the dining room, the cell over the marriage bed, Christ over any earthly groom, they walk with us still. These mothers of monasticism who proved that saying no could be the most profound yes. Every nun who takes vows today stands on ground they sanctified with their refusal. Every woman who chooses God over conventional happiness follows a path they cut through impossibility. We met Syncletica, trading silk for sackcloth in her cave by the river, teaching that transformation begins when you stop running from yourself and start running toward God. We walked with Matrona, creating the first domestic monastery, proving that holiness didn't require fleeing to the desert. Sometimes the greatest wilderness is your own family's expectations. We sailed at midnight with Paula, escaping Rome's golden cage for the freedom of poverty in Bethlehem, showing that wealth's greatest value lies in what you can build when you give it away. We stood in the tomb with Marcelina on Christmas Eve, watching her trade visible marriage for invisible union, demonstrating that consecrated virgins could transform the world while remaining in it. We counted coins with Melania, learning that golden chains can be reforged into keys that unlock minds. We witnessed Olympias facing down an emperor, her simple no, more powerful than all his purple silk and military might. ... We discovered Emilia, the mother who couldn't choose virginity for herself, but made it possible for her daughters, proving that revolution sometimes looks like raising children who don't know the world expects them to be ordinary. And finally, we stood in the desert at the turn of the century, watching wasteland bloom with women who discovered that choosing nothing meant gaining everything. If you're still awake, if these stories of first rebellion stirred something in the darkness of your own heart, leave a candle emoji in the comments below. Light a small flame for these forgotten mothers who lit the way for every woman who would come after. Your small gesture joins with theirs across the centuries, another point of light in the darkness. Another thread in the tapestry of sacred choice. Rest now. Let their courage settle into your dreams like sand settling after a desert storm. Dream of women saying no so fiercely it sounds like yes. Dream of virgins who were anything but passive. Dream of mothers who raised revolutions. Dream of widows who found freedom. Dream of the 1,000 different ways women discovered to choose God on their own terms. But remember, as sleep takes you deeper, this is just the beginning of their story. We've witnessed the birth, the first wild flowering of female monasticism. But births are messy, chaotic, full of possibility and danger. What comes next is equally fascinating. Next time, we'll meet the women who took these raw beginnings and shaped them into something that could last. Bridget of Kildare, building a double monastery that became a city of God in Ireland's green heart. Radegund, the Frankish queen who escaped her throne for the cloister, proving that even royalty could choose poverty. Hilda of Whitby, the abbess who taught bishops and hosted synods that would shape Christianity's future. We'll explore how the wild diversity of the desert years gave way to rules and structures, how women who'd fought for the right to define their own spiritual lives found themselves fighting to maintain autonomy within increasingly male-dominated church hierarchies, how the radical became routine, but in becoming routine, also became permanent. The thread continues, dear one, from desert cave to Irish abbey, from Syrian pillar to Frankish cloister, from the first brave women who said no to all the others who would follow, each adding their own color to the tapestry, their own note to the song that still echoes in every convent, every monastery, every place where women choose the eternal over the everyday. But for now, let their beginnings be enough. Let Syncleta's cave shelter your dreams. Let Macrina's wisdom guide your sleeping thoughts. Paula's midnight voyage carry you to peaceful shores. Let all their voices braid together into a lullaby of sacred rebellion, singing you to sleep with the knowledge that sometimes the greatest revolution begins with a woman walking alone into the desert, carrying nothing but the certainty that there must be another way. Sleep in their courage, dream in their freedom, and remember, some chains are broken not with force, but with choice, not with swords, but with silence, not with manifestos, but with lives lived so differently that they remake the world's imagination of what's possible. The first sacred vows have been spoken. The precedent has been set. The door has been opened. And through that door, across the centuries, millions of women have walked into lives they could finally call their own. Rest now, knowing you've witnessed the beginning of something that never ended. The first women who chose God over the world's plan. The candle burns low. The story pauses but doesn't end. And somewhere between sleeping and waking, between history and eternity, between what was and what is, the first sacred vows continue their endless vigil, reminding us that some freedoms are found not in having everything, but in choosing one thing completely. Until next time, dear wanderer, may you wake refreshed, carrying their strength into your own day. May their ancient courage inspire your modern choices. And may you remember always that the path they cut through impossibility remains open still, waiting for any who dare to walk it. The desert blooms eternal. The sacred no echoes still. And in convents and monasteries around the world, women continue the work these pioneers began, proving daily that some revolutions never end, they just deepen with time. Sweet dreams, wrapped in their sacred silence. The story continues when you're ready to hear it.